Hello, and welcome to Introducing Me. I'm your host, Sarah. I started this podcast to get to know other people and lifestyles while discovering more about myself. Each episode, I will give a new guest a chance to discuss their background, culture, interests, or whatever they want to talk about to help increase all of our own worldviews. Today, I would like to introduce you to Jack Schaefer. He is a lifelong practitioner of Asian martial arts and a doctor in the Chinese medicine world. So I'm excited to have Jack here today to share more about his experiences and the life path he has taken. So thank you so much, Jack. Why don't you go ahead and tell the audience more about yourself?
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Um, God, where do I start? This is always such a funny question, and because I've been involved in martial arts culture and Chinese medicine culture and whatnot, you know, ever since I can remember, and so I don't really know a life without it. Um, but I guess I can say that I live a life of momentum. I as a kid, I was like 6 or 7 years old. My parents put me in a judo class because I had some sort of interest in martial arts. I don't even know if I knew what it was necessarily, but I thought it looked cool. I liked the uniforms that people were wearing. And I don't even know where that interest came from. I do know that, somebody that lived a few doors down from me was a martial arts teacher in the town that I was living in. And I used to go over to his apartment and I would stand there and I would look in the window and I'd knock on his door and ask him to if he would come out and hang out and throw the ball, and he would show me his martial arts stuff. And I think maybe I had some interest as a little kid from that. And as like I said, I got a little older, my parents put me in a judo class, and then eventually I ended up studying with that same person. And I just grew up in this Asian martial arts culture, and I got really interested in all the facets of it aside from the punching and kicking, the sort of violence side of it. I mean, as a kid and a teenager, that stuff is really interesting and attractive in many ways. But there was also so many other things that I really grew an appreciation for: the culture, the language, those sorts of things. And not in a weird anachronistic sort of way. Like I never saw myself like reliving as a ninja or a samurai or something like that, or somebody in a kung fu film. But I just had this real interest in the culture. And even as a young kid, I started trying to teach myself Japanese. My mom got me books on Japanese language, and so I would learn them. And as time went on and I got a little older, I started teaching martial arts, and I was going to college, and I had this really amazingly influential martial arts teacher at the time. Um, I was fortunate enough to have many teachers. My teacher at the time felt like if there was something you needed that he couldn't teach, he would find somebody that could. And so he introduced me to a really interesting person who became amazingly influential on me, for really up until he passed away just a few years ago. And he used to say, he's like, when we were young and we were studying, we would also, besides learning the martial arts, we would learn medicine. And he said, you really should learn some of the medicine because it's not just about hurting people. You have to learn to help people. You have to have this balance in your life, you know. And at the time I was, in my 20s, I thought, well, it'd be great for my students. If my students get hurt, I can help them and that kind of thing. And I wasn't as interested in it from the larger scale as I could have been. But you know, I decided, well, this is something I want to do. And so I started pursuing the idea of studying medicine. That said, I didn't really know what kind of medicine I wanted to study. I was interested in Western medicine. I was interested in chiropractic. I was interested in osteopathy. I was interested in Chinese medicine. I'd had all of those, experience with all of those growing up. So I was comfortable with all of them. I'd had acupuncture, I'd had massage, I'd had chiropractic. And so I was applying to multiple types of schools and thought I would just see what would happen. I was really, honestly, I think I was just looking for some sort of divine sign, like go here, do this one, you know. But so I was just waiting, and I was doing my applications, and then at the same time, I was training really hard and I was getting ready to do some international competitions, and I got a really bad knee injury. And so I went to this surgeon, and the surgeon evaluated me, and he was just a real unfriendly. I don't really know how to say this kindly, but we just didn't really meet eye to eye. And being an impetuous 20 something, I was like, okay, well, there's no way this guy's touching me. So I decided I'll just use natural medicine. I can do acupuncture, I can do chiropractic, I can take herbs, I can do exercises. My knee injury isn't going to kill me. I can always get the surgery if it doesn't repair itself. And sure enough, I never had to have surgery. To this day, that knee is amazing. And so, I really fell in love with the idea of natural medicine at the time then. And so I had been given the opportunity then from that teacher. He's like, well, if you really want to do Chinese medicine, if there's something you really want to do, I can introduce you to a friend in Taiwan. Their family have been doctors for multiple generations. I can send you there. You can learn their family's martial arts and their medicine. And I was like, this sounds amazing. And so I decided I'm going to do this. And then I sold my house. I started getting ready to go. And my dad said to me, well, if you go and do a foreign apprenticeship like this, can you get licensed when you come back? My father was always the pragmatist. And I thought, well, I don't know, actually. I better find this out. And I found out that it's really difficult to get licensed in the United States doing a foreign apprenticeship. So I figured, well, I better do this so I can make money when I come back. So I decided I would go to school. And so I ended up going to a U.S. Chinese medicine school in Oregon. So I got my master's there, and I decided, well, after I do this, I can get licensed and I can go to Asia anytime I want to, as much as I want to. And so when I finished school, I didn't have a lot of money being a student, which I'm sure many people can relate to. So I knew mainland China was less expensive than Taiwan. So I went to mainland China to continue my studies, and I stayed there for a few months. And after that, I did a stint of living and teaching in Portugal, and then I came back to the United States, where I started practicing and running a clinic here. And in the meantime, I continue to go back to Asia. I've been back to China to study now like 20 times or so in the last 2.5 decades. So, in fact, I just came back a couple of weeks ago from a quick trip over there. And, I feel like I have this freedom. I can go as much as I want to. And so my life it has this momentum. The martial arts just continues. The Chinese medicine continues. It's pretty wild. That is the 5-minute version of the question you asked.
That is okay. I think it gives some good foundation to kind of understand, what's been going on. And there's lots of different questions I can ask. I want to start with kind of what attracts you to continue going back to China. Are you always educating yourself further, or are there other things that, kind of lulls you back into China?
Oh, that's such a cool question. And I think that if you asked me that question every year, I would probably answer it a little bit different, you know? Um, I do have this love affair with Asia and, Asian culture. Really, it's really interesting. I mean, it's definitely not in a weird sort of fetishistic sort of way. I just have this appreciation for the history that culture has managed to build, you know, whether it's Japan or China or Korea or whatnot. And when I first was going, my first interest was really to study medicine and martial arts second, and I had these really great teachers in China that I would go work with pretty regularly, both in martial arts and medicine. But as I age, that the desire to go there coupled with what I'm learning or studying changes. And so it was really for a long time very heavy on medicine and martial arts. And then as time has gone on, it's leaned more into the study of Daoism and meditation and sort of personal spiritual development. And that has been my focus probably the last 10 years, more so than the medicine. I definitely do still go to study medicine, but now the medicine is a little less like working in the hospital and more like, spiritually based medicine or things like that. And, that those desires or that pull I feel sort of rotates back and forth each year, you know, or each time I go.
Yeah, that's understandable. And so is martial arts still like a big part of your life that you're still teaching, or has that kind of waned and waxed as well throughout time?
Yeah, my relationship with martial arts has also grown a lot in the last, probably 25 years, especially. It's something that I personally do every single day. I still train every day to some degree. Maybe it's not very much on some days, maybe some days it's a lot. It depends on how busy I am and what my life is being, what kind of burdens my life is being fed at the moment. Um, I'm always interested. I'm a very curious person, and so while I spent a lot of time very focused in specific martial arts, so I grew up doing judo and karate, and then I started doing Chinese martial arts, and I ended up doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and so I got black belts in multiple arts, including the jiu-jitsu. But as time has gone on, I tend to look at myself and think, oh, what are the holes in me as a practitioner? What are the things that I'm missing? And not necessarily in that sort of. It used to be when I was younger, almost like a fear, like, how can I be better? How can I be more proficient or tougher or that kind of thing. But as I got older, it started to be more like, well, what am I missing in terms of how my body feels? And so, now my relationship to it is really interesting because I'm much more focused on how I feel physically, how it helps my flexibility or my coordination or my strength, my balance, all of those kinds of things. I'm not really too worried about fighting or the need for self-defense. I mean, that's something we should, you know, probably always be aware of. But I also don't think that that's a good place to live where you're constantly in fear of needing to defend yourself. I think that that's really bad for our mind. And so I don't go there personally as much. And I'm also really cautious about how training can cultivate sort of personal violence. People always talk about martial arts as being a um, a way of kind of managing that. But also, if you spend a lot of time thinking about hurting people, you're thinking about hurting people, you know, even if it's in a class with friends and you're still thinking about hurting people. And I think that's something we have to be careful of, you know. So that's my own personal inner revelations. And I can't really force those on other people or make other people think that way because everybody has their own journey. But the as far as teaching goes, then, when I work with students, you know, I just be open about what it is to me, and but I open the whole book, and I let them go where they have to go and let their path unfold. As far as teaching goes, I used to teach group classes before COVID, and then after COVID, I've only been working with private students now in kind of one-on-one sort of scenarios. I'll probably start the group classes back up again soon, but um, I've enjoyed doing the private teaching with just some of the students that have worked with me for
Mhm. And I agree that I think, a lot of people, when they think of the martial arts, they kind of think of that more violence or self-defense. So you mentioned kind of how you do continue to practice, you do teach, you kind of are working towards it every day. What does a daily practice sort of include?
Yeah. So my martial arts training, I usually think of it in a couple of different ways. I feel like we have the body health pieces of it that are built around like your strength, flexibility, coordination. Then there are pieces which are based on your um, fundamentals, like how you fundamentally move or develop power or something like that. And then there are there that spirals into like forms practices or drills or things like that. And then the third piece are application based, how you actually apply something. And so the part that I always will do will be the first part. So the um, flexibility, strength, coordination exercises. The second piece and the third piece, the drills and forms and the applications are the ones that I vary the most. So I usually, at this point in my martial arts career, and I've been doing this stuff for 40 some odd years, you know, I'm I usually have a project that I'm working on, whether it's a certain physical attainment or a certain skill that I'm trying to work towards. And so I always lay out my training plans based on what this thing is I'm trying to achieve. And so that then really can be anywhere from like 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the day, you know. So on days when I have a lot more time, I'll go end to end, or if I'm working with students, we'll work on applications maybe more than I might work on with myself.
Right. So martial arts led you to medicine and kind of giving that more holistic practice as the two connect with each other. So what sort of things did you learn and are you furthering in your studies when it comes to this Chinese medicine?
Yeah, that's a cool question. So, originally, like when I went to school, everybody learns the same sort of curriculum, these that allows you to get licensed. And um, it's a very sort of square curriculum. There's a box that it fits in around acupuncture and herbs and diet and pathologies and all those kinds of things. And we all have to gain a certain proficiency in that. For me, never being really satisfied with like the minimal amount. When I was in school, I also did apprenticeships with two different, Chinese professors. And so one of them I studied herbalism with, and the other one I learned a lot about massage and bone setting from. And so I was already trying to get out of the box and look for the weak spots in my education. And, I would just ask the teachers that were educated in China, like, what's the most important thing for you? What are the holes in our education? And then I would make pet projects around my study, and so I would study different things for a couple months that were outside the normal curriculum. I would try and dive deeper into. Then when I graduated, I went to China. I did the same thing. I would just look for all the weak spots in what we do because while it being educated in the United States, a lot of people we get a good education, but we don't get the volume of practice that a Chinese person does in the universities there because they'll see dozens of patients in a day. And here, as a student, in a student clinic, you might see, 3 to 6, depending on how many shifts you did. So we just don't get that volume that they get. And so while I was there, I was like, I need to do a lot of volume and just practice, like be okay with not being perfect and just practice. And so that was a real big part of it for a while for me. And then I met this doctor named Xie through a friend of mine, and Dr. Xie was a traditionally educated, so an apprentice educated Chinese medicine physician, but he was also a master of this Chinese martial arts called Baguazhang. And I became a student of his, and that system had this really amazing way of knitting the martial arts and martial arts philosophies and the medicine philosophies along with Chinese natural sciences. And so he had a really fascinating way of looking at the body, working with the body. He was an incredible doctor. And at the same time, being able to make it knit with and martial arts. And so I spent as much time with him as I could until he passed away, trying to understand how this all worked. And that set a pretty neat standard for me moving forward on how I would evaluate teachers and the things I wanted to learn from teachers. So what I would do is meet people and I would talk to them about what they do, and I would inside I'm thinking about their strengths and their weaknesses and how that would work for me as a student and a practitioner. And then if that worked, if it made sense, then and we had the Chinese term for this is yuanfen. We had like a karmic connection where they were willing to work with me and I was willing to work with them and we liked each other. Then I would spend time with them too, you know. So that's how that, you know, really affected my like basic practice of herbs and acupuncture and body work and all of the like the tools that people are familiar with. And as time has gone on, I've also gotten really deeply involved in what we call Daoist medicine, which is kind of a spiritually based medicine that's related to being Daoist. And so we look at things, not just the physical sides of people, like do they have headaches or back pain, but also things in their lives that don't necessarily, that are problems, but maybe they're more spiritually based, you know. I'm using that word kind of loosely, but they're related to karma or feng shui or you know interrelationships like somebody's um, birth chart related to like their partner's birth chart or something that creates a problem with that, and we can look at those things and come up with some predictions and sometimes some interesting solutions that are pretty novel and have nothing to do with needles and herbs, you know. So it's been a growing love of mine.
And do you have a specific specialty, like you're specifically doing acupuncture, or do you kind of are you able to practice all of these things that you're able to offer a wide array of services?
Yeah, so that's a great question. My clinical practice is I avoid specialty in terms of the things I treat, and that's mostly because I like puzzles, and I feel like I would be really bored if I was just doing one problem. Like if I just did fertility or if I just did endocrine disorders or something. I can't imagine doing the same thing for every day, all day. If there's an argument for it, and I don't fault people for who do that. But for me as a person, I would get bored, and I feel like boredom leads to complacency, and so I'm cautious of that. So I like general practice. So in a day, if I look at my book, there may be say there's 20 people in the book that day. I'm really excited when 15 at least 15 of them are a different problem. That keeps me interested. So then, the tools I use, I like to have that allows me to have a large toolbox. So my toolbox is, it has acupuncture and herbal medicine because those are things people always really want. But it also has dietary therapy. I do both Western dietary therapy, but also Chinese dietary therapy, and I usually knit them together so that they overlap and are use both make sense. I do lab testing and supplements and those sorts of things. I do the Taoist medicinal approaches if those are indicated. So what I usually do with somebody is I sit down and I look at the problem they have, and I decide, well, what tools make the most sense for this problem and this person, instead of always trying to use the same tool to fix everything. Doesn't make sense to me, and I also don't think it's fair to people. A lot of people just need herbs or just need diet or just need acupuncture or you know just need the Taoist medicine or something. It's variable, and so what I do is I kind of figure out, I think this group of tools would be best for you. This is what I think we should do and how we should do it, and then I allow the patient to they make the decisions. People often forget that healthcare practitioners work for you, the patient. A lot of times we're made to feel like we're second to the doctor, and that's just not the case.
Mhm. And so because, you're not in China and you are, in the States practicing various types of medicine, including bringing in some Western practices, what is it like being maybe, I don't even know if it's considered like a minor form of medicinal practices, but maybe looked at in a way of like, I didn't go to the ER and get my knee surgery, like that it's maybe not considered the norm.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel two ways about it, to be honest with you. There's a part of me like that's like, oh, I would like to be thought of as well as a surgeon, and I'd like to be treated that way. And I mean, I have a doctorate. It's not an MD. It's a DACM. Like, it's I'd like to be treated that way, and I'd like to have the respect that we deserve, and be able to have a room in the hospital, and all these sorts of things. There's a part of me that wants that. Some of it's just my own ego, and some of it is for the profession as a whole. Like, I think the profession, it's a good profession. It helps a lot of people. It deserves a lot of recognition. You know, so there's a part of me that really sort of longs for that. There's a part of me that also, the complete, like, sort of opposite punk rock side of me is like disgusted by it. Doesn't want to be part of it, and actually likes having a small office that's not part of an HMO, that I have complete control of what's going on in there. And I can say no to things. I can, you know I don't have to deal with insurance companies if I don't want to. I can just be, you know almost under the radar in a way. I mean, we're not, but it almost feels that way because we're outside the HMO, we're outside the system, you know. So I'm of two minds of it, and on any given day, I suppose I probably feel one side of that coin more than the other, But I don't uh, I don't have a strong feeling either way, because I like both.
Yeah, I love the juxtaposition you have there that you're able to kind of see it from two different lenses and not, pigeonhole yourself into this one way. Do you have good relationships with other practitioners in your area that are more traditional in terms of like having an MD or something like that?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I have a lot of MDs that are patients. I mean, I live in Boulder, Colorado. Um, it's a very open community. We have a large um, amount of alternative medicine here, you know, and so there are many doctors here that are really open to what we do. And as long as what I've found is they'll usually be open to what we do as long as we stay in our lane, so to speak, where we're not telling them what to do and trying to be like better than they are. And I don't mean we should kowtow to them, but I do mean that you know, we understand that these are our tools and these are our methodologies, and those are their tools and their methodologies, and learn to have a respectful communication with them. So I don't really have a whole lot of problems with that. I do have friends in other areas around the country that have more trouble with it than I do, maybe slightly more medically conservative areas. Um, but but here it's not a big deal. Like I said, I have chiropractors as patients, and I have a couple surgeons as patients. I have a neurologist who, he loves to come in and get treated with acupuncture because he gets to geek out on the neurology of how acupuncture works. And so he'll come in with a problem and we'll start doing it, and I can see the squirrel in his brain running on the wheel as he's trying to understand how that works from like a Western scientific point of view. And it actually ends up being a really fun time, you know, and he sometimes will explain things to me in a way that I didn't really know or didn't really understand, that he's figuring out. It really, it makes for an interesting time. I actually find that other alternative medicine practitioners are sometimes more difficult to work with.
Well, it's good to hear, how you have these connections and overall, in a good place in your area with different practitioners that, you do have a seat at the table. They do respect your work. You've mentioned a couple times how Taoism has come to more of an importance in your life. So you want to talk a little bit about what that means and what that has, like how that has enhanced your life.
Sure. So, if we go back to the story at the beginning where I was talking about kind of my childhood getting into martial arts and whatnot, at that same time, I was dabbling in and exploring in my teens anyway, you know, aspects of Taoism, Taoist literature or practices or meditation or whatnot. And I think I didn't really understand it very well. I wanted to learn more about it. A lot of the things I thought it was, it definitely isn't. And as I studied it in college. I studied Daoism and both Japanese and Chinese languages and classical Chinese. And so, I can speak, read, and write Chinese. And I think that, I started exploring more about Taoist religion. And originally it was just because I wanted to understand like the mind of the people that created all this interesting culture stuff. I think that's really where I was. And then as time grew on, I really like kind of fell in love with the viewpoint of the world more directly, and the practices and how you live it. And you know I ended up finding these teachers in China that were, one of them is she's the abbot of a big temple, and she became one of my direct teachers. And I have another teacher who's a Taoist exorcist in Zhejiang. And I ended up getting involved with all of these teachers and having direct teaching from them. And really, they started to fill in all of these holes that were in my understandings of it for years of my life, because our understanding of it in the West is pretty small for the most part. And the more that they shared, the more they opened up, the more I fell in love with. And that has taken on such a big role in my life that actually, along with one of my really good friends, Josh Painter, we formed an organization called Parting Clouds Daoist Education, which is a an educational platform that functions as a community to teach Taoism to Westerners. And so through that process, we've managed to transfer the things that we both have learned from our teachers in China in our own studies into a curriculum that we can share with students, who don't have access to the language or the ability to go to Asia or whatnot. And now we have students all over the world. We have students in all across the United States and Canada and Mexico, the Caribbean, France, England, Ireland, Russia, Australia. I mean, we have students Germany. Like, there are people everywhere that work with us through our programs there, and that has been really liberating because now I've got reasons to spend more time studying that stuff, and that all circles back into helping me understand my path more in medicine and my path in martial arts and all these other life paths.
That's exciting. And I'm curious if you're willing to share because all these different paths you've taken, they started when you were young, what it was like what your household was just like growing up in general. Like, was it very traditional or were they like, be free, learn all of the things?
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I think I was lucky with my parents. I really do. Um, my both of my parents they grew up kind of traditional Catholics, and but neither of them were really. They were both kind of ex-Catholics. I remember going to church as a really little kid, but that was a real small part of my childhood. I think they both decided it wasn't for them, and then we, my parents divorced when I was pretty young too. I was third grade or something like that, and so they were exploring their own sort of path, and they they both had a real alternative mind to the world. They were both interested in alternative thinking and medicine and whatnot. And so my mom was very interested in nutrition and vitamins and was always really careful with us and health foods and stuff like that. And my dad got very interested in Buddhism and you know meditation and all the things that were kind of popular in the 70s. They were both, I think, exploring like the late stages of being a hippie or something. And so they never really pushed me in a particular direction. I don't ever remember that, but I do remember just a support of, okay, you want to do this? Okay. I think the only thing they ever pushed in the beginning was the martial arts part. The rest of it was just like, you want to do this? Okay. Go ahead. Like that sort of thing.
Right. Well, it's great to hear that you had that foundation of them, kind of supporting where you wanted to go. And, it's the one thing they maybe did push kind of led to everything else. And I'm curious because I don't think you mentioned it. What did you first study when you went to college?
What did I first study? So, so I started college, and I think when I first enrolled, I think I thought I was going to do business. You know, I, and I think that's because that's what people tell you. You're like, oh, you should just get a business degree, and you know, my dad was that's what he studied, and his my uncle, and but I really had no interest in it. I think I got a year into the idea of it, and I was like, this is just not for me. I'm not interested. And so I started taking classes, like random classes, like environmental studies classes and science classes. And that it was in that time where I decided, like, I think I want to go to medical school. And so I started, just pursuing the classes that you need to get into medical school. So college for me was definitely a discovery process. I think if I could have gone straight into Chinese medicine school or something like that, I might have, you know, because the person I was when I graduated compared to the person I was when I started, my interests and where I wanted to go really morphed a lot. I went from being thinking, oh, maybe I should go to business school to being like, I'm going to take Japanese and Chinese and Daoist classes, and I'm going to take these science classes so I can get into medical school, and you know, it took. I think, to be honest, I think it took me 5.5 years to get a bachelor's degree because I was doing that.
Well, you had some changing mindsets, figuring out where you wanted to be. I think, a lot of people struggle with making that decision when you're, 17, 18-year-olds, to be like, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to study that'll help me get there?
Yeah, and I don't regret. I don't no regrets at all. I feel good about the path.
Good. And I believe you mentioned that you can read, write, and speak Chinese. I think that
Uh-huh.
was, and so is that kind of your only language, or how did all that come about? Because I know that English is a hard language, though our native language, and then going into a language that does not use like the same sort of alphabet. What was all of that like?
Yeah. So when I was um, a little kid, like I said, my mom got me some books on learning Japanese because I really wanted to learn Japanese, and because my teachers they used Japanese words, and one of them spoke some Japanese, and I started to realize that if I learned to understand the language firsthand, I didn't need a middleman. I didn't need a translator because and it became really evident to me later through multiple experiences, but the idea of having to rely on a third person to be my conduit or my connection to teachers or learning really was a problem for me. I didn't like having to do that, you know. And so when I went into college, then I was like, well, here I am in college. I have an opportunity. You have to learn a foreign language to get out of school. So let's do it all, And so I did 3 years of Japanese, and I did, like I said, I did 3 years of Chinese and a year of classical Chinese, and it was hard. It wasn't really fun. My Japanese is pretty bad. I can read it a little bit still. I can understand a fair amount of it, but I don't speak it very well. Um, and that's mostly because I just don't have anybody to speak it to. So it's gotten pretty rusty. And I spent more time in China anyway. But they're tricky languages for sure. Um, I personally found Chinese easier than Japanese. That's my own opinion. I'm sure there are people that would argue with that, but the a lot of the structures, a lot of the early structures in the beginning are similar to English, where we do subject, verb, object kind of sentences. They also do that in like beginning Chinese, and so it was really much more comfortable. And because they both Chinese and Japanese use the same characters when they write, I was really comfortable with that too. It wasn't like I had to learn a whole another alphabet or whatever. It's a hard language. I wouldn't say I'm fluent by any means. I think fluency is, I have pretty high standards when it comes to fluency. I know people will say they're fluent, but I think that it's hard to be crazy fluent. And I can read pretty well. I can write pretty well, but I wouldn't say it's perfect by any means.
Definitely. It's interesting to hear how, you talk about these languages and, use cases for actually using them are so important for retention. That, it's understandable to hear how it's gone over time. Now we've talked about a whole bunch of things, a little bit of everything. But before I start to wrap things up, is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners today?
No, I mean, I think like that's mostly like my story. And if I have to sum up like a story, I have a 14-year-old son, and if he were to ask me like, you know, how do I how do I do a path? You know, how do I get on a path? How do I stay on the path? And I really I think of it this way, you know, you have to you always hear those people say things like, if you love it, follow it, and if you love it, the money will come, and those kinds of things. None of that is without work, you know. And I feel like, okay, so if you if your path is a river and you jump into a river that you want to be in, it's the river is going in a direction you want it to go. You don't know where that river goes exactly, but it's headed in a direction you want it to go. And you jump in one that you can tolerate the temperature. And so you jump in the river and you have to go with the river. You you can try and swim against it. And if you swim against it, you're going to have problems. You'll get tired and you'll sink, or you might even drown. So that's a problem. So if you find yourself swimming against the river, you're probably not in the right river, you know? So I think we have to realize that it's still a river. I still have to swim, but I want to be in the right river. And if I can swim, I just want to swim with the current. So I'm looking downstream so I can dodge the rocks and stumps and boats or whatever else is in the river. But I do have a choice then of where I go in that river. So we have to think two ways. I would say, buddy, find the river that you want to be in, that's flowing in the direction you want to flow. And then when you're in that river, swim with the river. Find a way to make sure you're not hitting in the obstacles. Because so many of us don't do that. And I was really lucky. I think I fell in the right river. I don't think I jumped into it. But through my life, through a lot of trial and error, I realized which direction I was swimming at some point, you know, and that's with it. So that's the only thing I would say.
Yeah, I think it's a great visualization and some good advice for people, figuring out where they want to be, what they want to do. So I appreciate you sharing that. Now, at the end of all my episodes, I do ask my guests a random question. So my question for you today is, what was your first ever job?
First ever job. Oh, so outside of like mowing lawns for like your parents and stuff like that, the first ever job that I got paid like a paycheck from was teaching karate to little kids. So I started teaching karate at a karate school when I was 14. So my parents would take me there. I would teach the kids classes. Then I would stay and I'd practice. And then when they closed at night, I would go home. That was my first job. It was a great job.
All right, that brings this episode to a close. So if you would like to connect with Jack, there will be 2 links in the description for him. One is that Daoist education organization that he was talking about, the Parting Clouds. So that link will be there, along with a link for his clinic if you are in his area. And of course, if you would like to connect with the podcast, our website is in the description. It brings you to all of our past episodes, past resources, past guest social media, all of those good things. It brings you to our social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you want to go like those pages, that support is always appreciated. If you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, there is a link to do that as well. And if you would like to share your story, my email is in the description. That is always the best way to connect with me. So thank you so much, Jack, for spending time with me today, and to my listeners for taking the time out of your day to hear a new story. Until next time, bye.
Bye. Thank you.